Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I hope you enjoyed this morning's presentations and discussion. I thought they were wonderful. We're so lucky to have these folks take their time with us today. So let's continue with our presentations. Our next presentation is by Maureen Russell. Sorry. She is an archivist at the University of California, Los Angeles, or better known as UCLA, Department of Ethnomusicology. Let me try that again. Department of Ethnomusicology. Maureen Russell is an adjunct professor in the Department of Ethnomusicology, specializing in audiovisual archiving, oral history, and information literacy and research skills. In addition, Ms. Russell is an archivist with the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive, one of the largest and oldest ethnographic audiovisual archives in North America. She has written 2 critically acclaimed books about television and film, such as Highlander, The Complete Watcher's Guide, and Days of Our Lives, A Complete History of the Long-Running Soap Opera. Wish I could read that. Since 2012, she has been an editor for Music Reference Services Quarterly, the section on Off the Beaten Path column, publishing 36 articles. And she is also the editor for Ethnomusicology Review from the Archives column. And let's see. And Russell was the 2021 UCLA Librarian of the Year. So without further ado, Ms. Russell, you're in.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. My name is Maureen Russell, and I am the archivist at the UCLA Ethnomusicology Archive. Thought I would start with a brief introduction to ethnomusicology at UCLA. The Institute, now Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA, was founded in 1960 by Dr. Mantle Hood. That is a picture of Dr. Hood in our original gamelan room. There were 2 founding principles on which he based the entire Institute, now Department. One was bimusicality and the other was research. On the left is Robert Ayite and Robert Bonsu, and they were brought to UCLA as master musicians with a Rockefeller Foundation grant that Dr. Hood received in 1958. It was for $38,000, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but in today's dollars, that would be $422,000. So it was a substantial grant. He was able to bring a number of master musicians to UCLA to teach our ensembles. And on the right is Charles Seeger, legendary musicologist. Some of you might be familiar with his son, Pete Seeger. When Hood wanted to hire him to UCLA, Seeger was 70 years old, and the university was very hesitant to hire him because they thought he was too old. But in fact, Hood prevailed, and Seeger was hired, and he worked for the next 15 years at UCLA, finally retiring at the age of 85. Now here's bimusicality. It was Hood's insistence that field workers, scholars and students, immerse themselves in the music as performers so that they could better grasp the conceptual and technical challenges. So just as one was bilingual, Hood said one should be bimusical, although as he pointed out, most of our students and faculty were in fact polymusical, is what he called them. And I wanted to show this photo because the gentleman in the middle is Don Borchert, and he founded our Music of Mexico ensemble. So because of Hood's insistence on bimusicality, we needed instruments for the students to play. So our World Musical Instrument Collection was built, also with that same Rockefeller funding. That's Mr. Louis on the left, who founded our Music of China ensemble, and Dave Morton on the right, who founded our Music of Thailand ensemble. So because we have what we believe to be the largest university-held collection of world musical instruments, one of the positions that is vital for us is to have a world musical instrument collection curator and conservator. And since 2017, our curator and conservator has been Dr. Supina Insi Adler. That's a photo of Supina there, and she plays the jaque, which is basically a Thai zither. So that's another potential position for the arts. So again, we've got by musicality, we have the World Musical Instrument Collection. Now we've got research. And as Hood said in 1957, source materials are scattered in diverse fields of knowledge, and the solution of a particular problem may require highly resourceful and imaginative research. And so thus was founded the Ethnomusicology Archive. Again, roots into the 50s, but we were officially founded in 1961. That gentleman there in the photo is Anthony, or Tony, as people who know him call him, Tony Seeger. And yes, grandson to the earlier mentioned Charles Seeger. And I hope you noticed the banjo head. That was a gift from the archivist to Tony. And it says, not lost forever, preserved for all to hear. This is a nod to his Uncle Pete's banjo. We'll hear more about Pete later in the talk. But that is in reference to a song that Tony wrote. And this is our first example of a work song. Technically, this is probably called a descriptive work song or an occupational song. But it is a song that Tony wrote, as he calls it, the Archivist Lament. Tony has very graciously made this available to everyone on a Creative Commons license. If I could sing, I would, but I can't, so I won't. But it is a quite wonderful song. The archivists all love this because it really gives a very good idea. It tells a great story of what it is like to be an audiovisual archivist. Because yes, collectors do love to store tapes in basements and attics. And yes, heirs throw materials out because they don't think it's important. And yes, we have all of these legacy formats that you can no longer play. So it's a brilliant song, and if Tony were here, he would sing, I guarantee. So just briefly, the ethnomusicology archaeology to preserve them and to make them accessible. I wanted to show this picture really quickly. Right before the pandemic, there's timing, we had a remodel and a grand reopening, and I wanted to especially show the photo on the right because that is just an example of the few of the people who have worked in the ethnomusicology archive over the years. Yes, my hair was red then. It's green, blue, and violet now, but it's me. This is our public space where we have lectures, we have talks, we have performances. So it's lovely to have a public space for us. And we also have an audio visual preservation digitization lab. And I wanted to show this because this is another possible occupation that one can have in an audiovisual archive. In fact, a few years ago, when the studios went more and more digital, a number of the sort of entertainment industry audiovisual engineers actually switched to archival jobs because we really need people who know how to work with legacy formats. So that's a little bit about the archive. Now I'm going to talk about work songs. Now, work songs are songs that are sung to help workers execute their task. It's basically the singing paces the activity of a single worker or it coordinates the motion of a group of workers. It can also be used to raise flagging spirits or maybe distract from the tedium of a monotonous task. Now, there are records, I don't mean recordings, I mean like written records, of work songs accompanying a variety of tasks, agricultural, pastoral, and domestic, across cultures in both pre- and post-industrial times. So this is a marvelous example of a work song. This is from the British Council, who has made a large number of their archival resources available online for use under Creative Commons license. I'll play a little bit of the beginning, and then I'm going to play a walking song, W-A-U-L-K-I-N-G. It's for the finishing of the wool.
Facing the Atlantic, off the northwest coast of Scotland, are the islands of the Outer Hebrides. On these western isles live men and women who speak and sing in the ancient Gaelic tongue. Their songs are about the sea, of the wind and the rain, about fishing, farming, and the weaving of tweed, about life on the bare, rocky, gale-swept land which is their home.
And that was an example of a walking song or finishing the wool song. In the US, probably the preeminent example in the Anglo-American folk tradition are seamen singing sea shanties. Some of you might remember during the pandemic, somehow sea shanties went viral on TikTok. Scholars often classify shanties according to the type of work. They're either hauling sails, which means you're trying to increase power, or heaving sails, which means you're trying to slow things down. And I should also point out that the majority of images I'm using here from the Library of Congress, they're all in the public domain, but if you're interested, I've given you the captions, so you should be able to find them. I'm going to play an example here from Pete Seeger of a sea shanty called Blow the Man Down. This is from Smithsonian Folkways, who very kindly always leaves 30-second samples on their website for us to hear.
And you know, every job of work there ever was had a song to go along with it. Every job of work that a man or woman ever did. Everybody knows the sailor songs. Blow the man down, bullies, blow the man down. To me way, hey, blow the man down. Blow the man down, bullies, blow him away. Give me some time to blow the man down as I was a-walking down Paradise Street.
So that was Pete Seeger. But there were also cowboys on the Western Plains who sang to their cattle to calm them during the roundup or trail riding. Generations, soldiers have sung marching songs to help synchronize their steps and raise their spirits. But now what's probably a little more popular than work songs are what people are probably going to call either descriptive work songs or possibly occupational songs. And these are songs about the work process, sometimes sung during work hours, but often during leisure time. And these songs typically deal with the hazards and hardship of the occupation concerned, but they can also extol its delight or immortalize people and events. There we go. So deep sea sailors, for example, had their songs about famous vessels, memorable sea battles, and pirates. Riverboat roustabouts were counted famous river races. And cowboys in the bunkhouse often recalled tragic stampedes or errant cowboys. And this is an example of, from, again, Folkways, thank you, Smithsonian Folkways, called The Streets of Laredo.
As I rode out in the streets of Laredo, as I walked out in Laredo one day, I spied a young cowboy all wrapped in white linen, wrapped up in white linen and cold as a clay.
It's a very well-known song. I think many of you might have, many of you might have heard that. Lumberjacks also wrote songs. Again, these are all photos from the Library of Congress. These mill hands often complained of their oppressive life in the mill or mill town. And I really wanted to include an image from the Lewis Wicks Hine collection. If you are not familiar with Lewis Wick Hines, I would highly encourage you to go look at his work. He worked for the National Child Labor Committee. The committee was founded in 1904 and actually worked well into the 1990s. But starting in 1908, they hired Hine to basically be what we would probably call now an investigative photojournalist. And so his whole job was to document child labor in the mines. In the mines, in the mines, in the mills, in various industrial plants. So it's a really important collection, and I encourage you to look at it. Rail workers also sang songs about train wrecks and celebrated engineers. Railroad songs are also interesting because they can express the diversity of railroad workers. For example, there were over 3,000 Irish immigrants, many of them who were Civil War veterans, who comprised a large part of the workforce on the Union Pacific. Many of them had come to the US a decade or so earlier. Part of the diaspora precipitated by Ireland's Great Famine, or what they would call in Ireland the Great Hunger. So this is just a brief snippet of one of those songs. This is called Pat Works the Railroad. I can speak.
In 1841 I put me corduroy breeches on, I put me corduroy breeches on to work upon the railway. A filling me uri-iri-a, a filling me uri-iri-a, filling me uri-iri-a, a working on the railway. In 1842 I left the old world for the new. I cursed the
Nope. And then I wanted to play a slightly more recent 15 Chinese workers who comprise the majority of the Central Pacific workforce. They were the ones who worked on the difficult stretches of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is a song, if you are unfamiliar with her, this is a song sung in part by Nobuko Miyamoto. If you don't know her, I would highly encourage you to look at her website. She is an artist and an activist, and this is just a little bit of a song. This is from 73.
We are the children of the migrant worker. We are the offspring of the concentration camp. Sons and daughters of the railroad builder. Leave their stamp on America.
Miners, obviously, I think many people are familiar with mining songs. The mining songs talked about explosions and social hardships. And again, this is another photo from Louis Wicks Hine. And I'm going to play a little bit of 16 Tons because I feel like that's probably a mining song that most people know. I suspect people know Tennessee Ernie Ford's rendition if you know it, but I want to play a little bit of it.
I loaded 16 tons. Now what do I get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
I want to mention, if you don't understand that lyric, he owes his soul to the company store, because this is going to come up a little later in the talk, because the miners worked in the mines and they were paid, but they had to live in company housing and do all their purchases at the company store. So they were basically working to pay the company to live. So that will become relevant a little bit later on also. So descriptive work songs are not necessarily composed by the workers themselves, nor are they sung exclusively by them. They're sometimes sung by professional performers. Now, in contemporary life, this is something ethnomusicologists talk about. Workers are really relying heavily on streaming services, radio, television, film for their entertainment, and they're much less likely in the past to compose and sing their own songs. So not only are work songs dying out because people generally aren't singing work songs, but also these descriptive work songs, these occupational work songs, are generally not sung by the workers. Now, interestingly, they have become a really important genre in vernacular music, especially country music. You have examples like Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, Johnny Paycheck's Take This Job and Shove It, Kenny Chesney, George Strait, Shift Work, Merle Haggard, Working Man Blues, Alan Jackson, Hard Hat and a Hammer. And the thing that I would say is probably most different about the songs today is rather than the workers singing them, these are multi-millionaire recording artists singing them. So it's become a very different genre than it used to be. So now we're going to move to labor songs. So, since the Industrial Revolution, working people have been organizing and campaigning for better treatment from their employers. The labor movements and its unions have fought and fight for fair wages, safe working conditions, dignity, and many other benefits. And music has been and is an important tool in the labor movement. It helps to motivate workers, it helps to build solidarity. Music can voice grievances, it can affirm the value of the worker to society, and express hope for life in a more just world. Labor songs these days are often very political, and they can glorify martyrs and heroes in the movement or inspire and uplift workers. Just a brief shout out to colleagues at the Library of Congress. If anybody is interested in learning more about organized labor, I would highly encourage you to look at the Library of Congress Research Guide on Organized Labor. So I'm going to talk about four seminal figures here. The first is Woodrow Wilson, Woody Guthrie. I hope some of you are familiar with Woody. This is a fairly famous photo of him. And what I want you to notice is his guitar. On his guitar is a sticker that says, "This machine kills fascists." If you look at his dates, you can see he was alive during the First and Second World War. And even though he was generally a pacifist, he supported the Second World War because of Hitler. So that's why "This machine kills fascists." Guthrie is arguably one of the most important folk music composers in U.S. history. His "This Land Is Your Land" is ubiquitous. I think probably everybody knows at least some of it, but I thought I might play a little bit of it because I'm also going to say something else about it. So this is just a little bit of "This Land Is Your Land." This is Woody singing.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters.
That's just a little bit of that. He was born in Oklahoma. He's sort of generally associated with the common people, and especially those displaced by the great dust storms of the 1930s, the so-called Dust Bowl. Woody was astonishingly prolific. He literally wrote thousands of songs, although in comparison, relatively few of them have been recorded. Most exist as lyrics on a page. Woody was known to pick up a newspaper in the morning and have a few topical songs written by lunch. He was a very passionate, talented writer. He wrote an autobiographical novel. Some of you might be familiar with the film, Bound for Glory. It was based on the novel. He was also an artist and produced thousands of pen and ink drawings. Now, one thing I want to give a shout out to is Mo Ash of Folkways Records. Some of you might be familiar with Folkways, now Smithsonian Folkways, but Mo Ash founded it primarily as a label to record folk music, traditional music, and also what we would probably call world music now. And so Folkways Records generated the majority of Woody's recordings. Mo gave Woody a stipend and to drop by the studio whenever he felt like it. I felt like making a recording. There's one famous one-day session from March 44, which yielded 75 songs. Woody was never a concert artist. He was never interested in being a concert artist. He generally performed for small groups and also at union rallies. He did sing on the radio and he wrote a newspaper column. And the thing about Woody is that his music and politics were always solidly intertwined. He saw music as a weapon to affect social change. His songs supported the rights of workers and those on the margins of society. His songs attacked unfairness in the American economic system and injustice to immigrants. And Woody was extremely influential in the next generation of folk artists to come, those in the late 50s and the 60s. Woody played in New York's Washington Square Park in the 1950s, influencing a number of young musicians, as I said, who helped spark the folk revival. One of those young musicians, Bob Dylan, I hope some of you have heard of Dylan, who said, "When I first started out, I was nothing but a Woody Guthrie jukebox." Jack Elliott, Bruce Springsteen, Bono, Annie DeFranco, Billy Bragg all point to Woody's influence. Now, I want to come back to This Land Is Your Land just briefly because, as I said, I think many people are familiar with this song, but most people know the first few verses, but in fact, there are 7. And I think the final verses are actually the ones that probably speak most closely to what Woody was trying to represent. He says, "As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said, 'No trespassing.' And on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. In the shadow of this steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, 'Is this land made for you and me?' And his final verse says, 'Nobody living can ever stop me as I go walking that freedom highway. Nobody living can ever make me turn back. This land was made for you and me.'" So, and the last song of Woody's I want to mention just because it really documents a very important and horrific historical event. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Ludlow Massacre. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was one of the largest mining companies in that time period, the late 19th century, early 20th century. They employed 7,000 workers and controlled over 70,000 acres of land. And they had one of the worst safety records of any of the mining companies. And so the United Mine Workers of America went on strike because the Colorado Fuel and Iron wouldn't give in to their demands. So as a result of the strike, you might remember in my 16 tons reference, right? The miners are living in company housing. So as a result of the strike, the miners and their families were evicted from the company housing and set up a tent colony. And on the morning of April 20th, 1914, National Guardsmen who were allied with Colorado Fuel and Iron attacked the tent colony to try to break the strike. And they killed 21 people, including 11 children, in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. And the ensuing public outcry led Congress to direct a House committee to investigate the events of the massacre and ultimately produced a report in 1915, which was instrumental in helping promote child labor laws and also enforcing the 8-hour workday. And in fact, you can go to, it is a National Historic Landmark. You can go to the site of the Ludlow Massacre. So the next of the big 4 I want to talk about is Joe Glazer. You might know him. I'm hoping you know him. He was often called labor's troubadour, and he spent a lifetime as one of America's most noted historians of labor song. He's written a number of significant labor songs. He was employed by a variety of unions, and probably one of the things some people know him for is he was the founder of Collector Records. And Collector Records is basically the label he started to be able to give workers a voice. So the third of our last of our 4 greats here is, I'm going to suspect the one least known, and that's John Hancock's. He was a singer, a poet, and a union organizer originally in the South in Arkansas. As Pete Seeger wrote when he first heard one of John's songs, "I was bowled over by the songs and poems and immediately started memorizing some of them and repeating them for my friends." Pete even traveled to the South to try to meet Joe, but he couldn't find him because by that time Joe had left, as he said, to avoid the, remember, union organizer, to avoid the wrath of Arkansas plantation owners. As John said later, they had the rope and the limb, all they needed was me. But as he often did for others, Pete really helped carry John's music into immortality. In 1940, Woody, mentioned him earlier, Pete and Alan Lomax, some of you might know Alan Lomax and his son John, they basically were folk music collectors. They did recordings throughout the world, but primarily in the US South. And they collected John's songs and poems into a book called Hard-Hitting Songs for Hard-Hit People. The manuscript was finally published in 1967. If you are unfamiliar with John, I highly encourage you to look at Michael Honey's book, Sharecropper's Troubadour, because he's a really an amazing figure. So really nobody heard from him for years until a bit out of nowhere in 1982, he contacted Joe Glazer, who alerted Pete and Ralph Rinsler. Some of you might know Rinsler, not necessarily as a folk singer, although he was, but as the founder of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And so Joe Glazer contacted Pete and Ralph Rinsler and said, "Hey, John is here. And so because Pete had been singing his songs for years, people knew John's songs. And so now in his 80s, he actually began a career as a living legend. John and Pete played together at the Clearwater Festival, at the Vancouver Folk Music Festival, at the Western Worker Heritage Festival, and in the Reagan era of union busting. This song may be relevant today. John's Mean Things Happening in This Land really struck a chord with a new audience. John was honored with the Joe Hill Award at the Labor Heritage Foundation in DC and feted in his own town of San Diego as a labor and civil rights icon. And our final of the big four is the legendary Pete Seeger, born in 1919, died in 2014. I'm hoping you can see the photo on the left. Pete's banjo was legendary. Again, this is a little bit of riff on Woody Guthrie's, right? The sticker on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists." On Pete's banjo, it reads, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." Pete was really the dean of the 20th century folk singers for over 60 years, again, until his passing in 2014. He performed and led his energies to causes in which he believed. He was in an indefatigable, I can speak, he worked hard for the union. He worked hard for the environment. He did a lot of work in trying to clean up the Hudson River. He was born into a musical family. Pete grew up surrounded by music. If you may remember way back to the start of this presentation, I mentioned Charlie Seeger, who was one of our founding faculty at UCLA ethnomusicology. It's also Pete's father. And his mother, Constance, was a concert violinist. Some of you might have heard of his siblings, especially Mike and Peggy, who are also folk singers. Most Seegers has some sort of performance in them. He actually went to Harvard, but he dropped out in 1938 and began working for Alan Lomax. You might remember him mentioning Alan Lomax. He worked for the Library of Congress, what was then called the Archive of Folk Song, which is now called the American Folklife Center. But again, recording U.S. artists, particularly traditional music, blues, folk music. In the early days, Pete accompanied Woody on one of his many trips west, and then he later joined Woody in probably what is arguably the first great topical singing group, the Almanac Singers. The Almanac Singers disbanded in 1945, and then Pete became the national director of what was called People's Songs, and then later People's Artist. But it was a national topical folk song organization and magazine that was a precursor to one that some of you might be familiar with, which is Broadside. And the slogan of the organization was "Songs of Labor and the American People." In 1949, along with Lee Hayes, Fred Hillerman, and Ronnie Gilbert, he formed the Weavers. Some of you might be familiar with the Weavers. They were really the first group from the folk song revival to have songs reach national prominence, particularly through record sales and radio, and their version of Lead Belly recorded by Alan Lomax, version of Lead Belly's Goodnight Irene reached #1 in 1951. However, Pete, as always, was very vocal about his political beliefs, and the group's so-called left-wing activities got them into quite a bit of trouble during the McCarthy era. And in fact, they found themselves blacklisted and unable to record, appear on television or radio, or perform in many concert venues. In fact, the blacklist would continue to haunt members of the group throughout the 50s and parts of the 60s. One of the things Pete did at this time was he sang in schools, and there's some historians and musicologists who would credit this as to being the start of the folk music revival, because all of those elementary and high school kids could have heard Pete sing in person. In 1943, Pete started recording for Mo Ash, again, Folkways Records, and Ash continued to record Pete during the 50s and beyond. Because Pete liked working with Mo Ash and Folkways Records because Pete was free to record what he wanted. Again, as I mentioned, Pete was blacklisted, and I wanted to read just a little bit of his testimony because I feel it is extremely relevant today. In 1955, when he testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or the McCarthy Committee, as some people call it, he said, I am not going to answer any questions as to my association, my philosophical or religious beliefs, or my political beliefs, or how I voted in any election or any of these private affairs. I think these are very improper questions for any American to be asked, especially under such compulsion as this. I would be very glad to tell you my life if you want to hear it. And in fact, if you read the whole transcript, you can. It is available. It's a congressional transcript. He tries very hard to tell them about his life, and multiple times he offers to sing for the Congressional Committee, but they are not interested in that. 2 years later, he was cited for contempt of Congress, and then 4 years after that, he was found guilty and in fact sentenced to a year in prison. But he was let free on bail, and ultimately his conviction was overturned in 1962. If you are interested in Pete, because he did have this just truly amazing life, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. Jim Brown directed a film called The Power of Song, which came out in 2008. It was actually co-produced by Toshi Seeger, who is Pete's wife. There's also Dave Dunaway's book, How Can I Keep From Singing? The Ballad of Pete Seeger. And then there's a new book that's just come out called Chopping Wood, Thoughts and Stories of a Legendary American Folk Singer, which is basically Pete in his own words. And I'm going to let Pete have the last word. Pete said, "My job is to show folks that there is a lot of good music in this world. If used right, it may help to save the planet." The end. Thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any questions.